Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Do I Have Time for This? The series that looks at old and new video games, both indie and AAA, to help you figure out if you've got the time to play, finish, 100% complete it, or just leave it in your backlog to forever gather dust. Today we're going to take a look at the first Ubisoft game in a long time that has, in my opinion, looked remotely interesting. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown is a hack-and-slash Metroidvania, which looked really inspired out of the gate following the travesty that was the Sands of Time remake trailer.
Only the dagger can unlock the sands of time. No!
We play as Sargon, the newest member of the ragtag group of mercenaries called the Immortals. This band of warriors all have unique abilities granted by the magical spirit known as Athra, and serve as protectors of Persia. The game proper kicks off following the tutorial battle with the Kushan Empire, whereby the titular Prince of Persia gets abducted and taken to Mount Kaf, an ancient and cursed city lost to time. Once the Immortals get there, all except Sargon quickly start getting influenced by the curse, and it's down to us to break the curse and free Prince Hassan from his captor. Monsters, betrayal, blood and sand. The one thing Sargon definitely has on his side is time. Whilst I personally feel The Lost Crown doesn't really do much to progress the Metroidvania genre, I do feel that it hits all the expected notes very well. Operating as a hack-and-slash meets Hollow Knight, this game couples complex platform puzzles alongside some great combat set pieces and boss battles. Firstly, the platforming, and possibly the only thing in The Lost Crown which felt left over from the original DNA of the Prince of Persia series. At first, I thought this would be the standard fare of dodge the spike traps and swinging blades like we've seen in every Prince of Persia game to date, but with the addition of some extremely clever time powers, courtesy of the Feathers of Simor, we actually get to see some real head-scratcher puzzles. In some cases, I actually spent some time sitting and trying to figure out what I'd do next, rather than just running in and figuring it out. Ubisoft Montpellier used the 2D space to its full extent here, not just putting long corridors of spikes and blades, but offering some real verticality to allow us the ability to tackle some sections in multiple ways. For instance, a late game unlock I'll not spoil allows us to bypass huge platforming sections at the press of a button, and really nails the core Metroidvania concept of becoming unstoppable by the end of the game. I genuinely found the time abilities they added to be implemented in a variety of exciting ways, and though we had the usual double jump and air dash abilities, the others allowed you to play around with combat too, even being useful in boss fights without specifically telegraphing a need for it. Exploration is one of the few areas of innovation we can find in the game, where Prince of Persia allows you to take screenshots of the map, in-game, at any time, so you can physically see what you need to come back to later, rather than putting a simple treasure marker and trying to remember what was there. A great innovation that I hope is in every Metroidvania moving forward. The combat in The Lost Crown is one of those really hard to describe systems, in that there's a really high skill ceiling for being amazing at the combat, but it's also simple enough that you can spam the basic attack button, occasionally parry or dodge, and you'll win 90% of encounters. I personally tried to steer clear of doing this at first, as there were a great many techniques available for aerial combat, which significantly rewarded you in terms of Athra build-up for your special moves. In terms of parrying, I played the game through on the hard difficulty, and found the parry window to be fairly narrow, but doable. Where I really struggled are the yellow attacks enemies do. These yellow attacks are power moves from the monsters which do additional damage, but unlike the red attacks which have to be dodged, you can parry them for a near instant kill move. My issue with these attacks is the majority of the normal enemies Sargon fights went to the Elden Ring school of delaying attacks. so they just take a little bit longer than you'd expect to actually pull off the attack. This was worse in the boss fights, but we'll get to that. The special attacks you unlock, which are equipped when you're at the Whack Whack trees, this game's version of benches or bonfires, are cinematic attacks which take on a huge variety of forms. I think there's about 10 or so in the game to choose from, and can range from power level 1 to 3, each with their own cooldown. My only issue with these attacks, as they are cool to pull off and mostly earned through parrying, is that after a while you'll have your favourite and you'll not really mix them up to test new ones out. They also take a fairly long time to use, and when you've seen it 50 times by the end of the game, it just feels like a drag. Amulets are the equivalent of charms on this game, which allow you to get different buffs and abilities for Sargon to use throughout the game. Often a reward for exploration or puzzle solving, none of these amulets are anything that completely transform the gameplay or stand out as must-haves, but I think what will happen is you'll pick the ones you want, then upgrade them till you don't really need any of your new ones. This is a problem I find in many Metroidvanias, and results in the typical aspect of ending the game with a boatload of excess currency to spend. Boss fights in this game are incredible, but come with a few caveats. I love the designs of the bosses, and whilst I guessed a few, which I'll talk about later when I give impressions on the story, the large majority of these bosses were memorable and cinematic in a way you don't often get in a Metroidvania. I think we really could have done with a few more of the screen-filling monster bosses though, as they are the main highlights for me personally over the humanoid bosses which plague the latter half of the game, with an exception of the second last boss, which was by far my favourite. There are definitely some bosses that are essentially mini-bosses that you'll fight again later, but even these have a unique twist on their boss variant that makes them feel like more of an event than just big version of enemy.
So here's this giant enemy crab.
I'm personally not sure how I felt about the boss difficulty, as I often backtracked when getting a new power. I was as upgraded as I could be against most bosses, and never felt like I was really that challenged in the Lost Crown, and I beat most bosses within a few tries, some even first try. Something I really wasn't a fan of with the bosses was the yellow attacks I mentioned earlier. Different to the regular enemy yellow attacks, the boss versions are almost impossible to avoid, so you just have to get the parry timing down. An early game on hard difficulty, missing one of these parries resulted in more or less instant death. It's also worth noting these boss special moves take longer than Sargon's special moves, so if you mess up the parry timing, the game takes it upon itself to rub it in your face for the next 30 to 60 seconds straight. Also, shout out to one of the late game bosses who, to undermine people who spam attacks, decides to have his yellow attack as a defensive move and uses it non-stop. By far the worst boss in the game. Something I felt was fairly fresh when I first saw the trailer for this game was the change in art direction, but the more I sat with it, the less I feel like I liked where Ubisoft went with the Lost Crown. Out of the gate, we get a very Disney-esque animation style of all of the different immortals, with them all having wide open smiles and quippy lines, which felt straight out of more recent Disney animation methods. We do get some more serious tone in terms of the enemy design and some of the environments, but the tone of the immortals at the beginning amidst the war and a failing Persia really did throw me off. The characters do become a bit less one note after a while, but I honestly didn't feel too involved here. I will give props for one of the best uses of time powers I've ever seen in the game though. I'll not spoil it, but one of the later game areas was something I felt gave the Quicksilver scene from the X-Men movie a run for its money, in terms of its raw visuals. Honestly, I've never seen anything this immediately impressive, and it's purely an environment design, even if the resulting boss fight at the end of that area was a little predictable. We also see some enemies reverse throw spears as part of their attack, which is such an ingenious way of showing this kind of time distortion, but just wasn't used enough for my liking. Both Sargon and the many bosses' special moves I mentioned earlier burst with the spirit Athra, which typically is differently coloured based on the person using it, but really stands out against the sandy colour palette used in the game, which you'd expect in the desert. Enemy designs are nothing new or out of the box in the Lost Crown. We often see your standard zombie/skeleton type enemies, of which there are a lot of variants, but other than a few mythological type creatures, we didn't get much else out of what you'd expect. So, let's get down to it. How long does this game take? In my playthrough, which netted me a comfortable 90% for completion, I spent around 20 hours, and I was playing fairly slowly. Completionist is probably around 30 hours if you want to find every single collectible and do every single side quest, depending on if you use a guide. Mainline story, you're looking at around 15 to 20 hours, depending on if you struggle with the combat or the bosses, which I think if you play on any less than hard, you'll breeze through this game. Achievement wise, there's not much outstanding beyond the typical 100% the game and all the upgrades, although there are some late game challenges which may take a bit more time to complete. In terms of replay value, once you finish the game, that's more or less it. You can go back through the palace and explore for some more upgrades or character skins, which I do like as a reward for exploration, but none of the amulets are going to make a particularly interesting build that'll make you say, hey, I'm going to do a playthrough with this type of build, or anything like that. I'd say the one thing to err on the side of caution with for this game is, as with a lot of Metroidvanias, you can't save your progress unless you've just picked something up or hit a checkpoint. So if you can only game for a short amount of time, you may find yourself not being able to save as often as you like. Ubisoft did make the levels flow quite nicely, so you can loop back to a save point fairly easily from both side and story areas, but just something to be aware of if you press for time. So, my biggest gripe, which I've saved until so late in the video because of how little I think it impacts the overall package of the game, is the story. I've already mentioned the Disney-like characters of the Immortals, where they all fit into the boilerplate archetypes of your band of merry men, but there's a bigger issue of the actual plot. Without spoiling anything, I guess the mid-game twist during the first 20 minutes of the game, it's that obvious. Hell, watching this video right now, I bet some of you would have already guessed what happens too. There's also a weird disconnect with the end, where you beat the final boss and it just never explains how or who gets out of the cursed city. We also have a character who's in the introduction, then the only other time you see them is if you decide to explore a late game area early. Otherwise, they just vanish from the game entirely. Then at the end of the game, Sargon just says they died, as if they got poochied out during the editing of the story.
Hey, Poochie, you look like you've got something to say. Do you?
Yes, I certainly do.
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
Wow, Poochie came from another planet? I guess.
Hey, that wasn't supposed to happen.
Whilst no one particularly comes to the genre for the story, most of the popular entries do try to elicit some great world building, which we don't really get here, and it's such a shame that this section is so weak compared to how solid everything else is. I also experienced a few bugs, one of them being able to walk out of a boss fight due to the invisible wall failing. Walking back in, the boss was gone, so I had to load a save. Then I had the most annoying bug of all, a quest broke. This simple fetch a parrot quest broke and stopped me getting 100% completion without restarting the entire game, and the only solution was to load up a previous save, which I was way past the point of, so simply gave up completing the game. I had a similar issue in a recent release which was the same, but given that that was an indie game, I felt like I could let it slide more. Just a warning to anyone playing who finds the parrot quest, do it immediately, and if it breaks, load your save or you will regret it. That being said though, I still fully recommend Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. Those who have been around for a while will know I'm a big sucker for Metroidvania, what with me being the top subscriber to any Silksong rumor on the market. With a cartoony art style, extremely solid hack and slash gameplay, with rewarding exploration and satisfying puzzle platforming, this is a game that I consider a must-have for the Metroidvania connoisseur. Whilst offering little in the way of innovation, what Ubisoft have done here is extremely solid and highly recommendable, with fairly short stints between checkpoints, which allows for both short and longer gameplay sessions for those taxed on time. Glitches aside, this package is well worth the time. My main gripe of the story and Disney-like characters can be overlooked when all the other ingredients in this mixture are some of the best in the genre. If this is the direction of the Prince of Persia franchise from now on, I'm more than happy to be along for the ride. With a few more innovative exploration features and some new time powers, a sequel could really be something special. So, do you think you have time for Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown? On this channel I like to give my thoughts on the game, alongside a bit more of a deep dive on the time you have to invest, so you know what you're getting into before you load it up. because time is precious, right? If you enjoyed the video or found it useful, feel free to like and share. If you subscribe, I'm looking to put out regular content like this alongside some more in-depth video essays and freeform videos, so stick around, and if you have any requests on future videos, just drop them in the comments. And finally, if you want to come chat with me, you can find me over on x.com/gracious_rhino. I'm Gracious Rhino, look after each other, and I'll catch you soon.